Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Our Crowd Meet the Managers session. I am Richard Norman, Managing Director of Funds here at Our Crowd, and I'm joined by my colleague Kafir Kakhlon, who is a principal on the investing side and the cannabis lead here at Our Crowd. Today, we are delighted to have with us Micah Tapman. Micah is the managing partner of 7thirty Opportunity Fund, which, as many of you will know, is a cannabis tech investment fund that we very recently launched up onto the platform. And so for today, we're going to spend the next hour or so talking to Micah about the industry, about things that he's seeing happening on the cannabis tech investing side, and then dive into some of the specifics of the fund that we've just launched together. Just a few housekeeping points before we get started. So as a reminder, with the webinar here, you will have the ability to ask questions, and you should see a panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you do have any questions that you want to ask, please type your questions in there. And we will do our best at the end of the session to spend some time with Q&A for the crowd, and let Mike have a chance to respond to any thoughts that you guys have. To the extent that we're not able to answer them, please feel free to follow up with your investor relations representative, either on those questions or on any other questions that you may have about the fund. And with that, let's dive right in. So Micah, firstly, thank you very much for joining us. Where are you right now?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm in Boulder, Colorado right now, enjoying ski season.
Very nice, very nice. Well, definitely colder than it is probably here in the Middle East. But why don't we, just to get us started, maybe you want to let us know a little bit of the background on you and how you found yourself in the world of cannabis investing.
Sure. Yeah, I wasn't expecting to get involved in cannabis investing when I first started my career. In fact, I started my career in the military and then got into cybersecurity when I left the military. So I spent well over a decade in the cybersecurity fields, working with Department of Defense in the United States and financial services organizations around the world. Also did a bunch of work with the Olympic Committee and some organizations like that. And, around 2010 to 2012, I exited a firm I'd started in the cybersecurity space and was looking to get involved in something new. As it happened, I had opened an office and moved out to Colorado right around then, and cannabis was legalized in the election in Colorado in 2012. So in my backyard, I'm seeing this new industry start to develop, starting to hear people getting involved. And a good friend of mine, Patrick Ray, we were actually out on a bike ride around Colorado, which is a very Colorado Boulder thing to do. And I asked, what are you up to? And he was actually leaving his job to start a venture capital fund in the cannabis sector. So I sort of said, that's interesting. And 6 months later, I joined up, and he and I started Canopy Boulder together back in 2013, 2014.
And Canopy Boulder was what, relative to the fund, maybe give us a bit of a background on what Canopy Boulder was and sort of the presence that it has in the market today.
Sure. So originally, as I mentioned, the idea was to start a venture capital fund, pretty traditional VC fund, targeting the cannabis industry. And what we realized when we started doing that research to get that set up was that the industry was not mature enough to support a classic venture capital fund. So we started brainstorming what else we might do, and we saw the business model from Techstars and Y Combinator of a business accelerator. And the business accelerator model is like a micro VC fund combined with a mini MBA program to help launch the best companies into the industry. So you give them a little bit of capital. You give them basically a 3 or 4 month program, like I said, mini MBA style. And those companies then go through that process. You typically will give them a little bit more capital later on, and then other investors will come in for the Series A and B rounds even later.
And give us a sense, if you can, of sort of how much capital you're investing here, how many companies went through the program, and to the extent that there have been returns that you can talk about, how performance has looked in the space.
Sure. So our first investment cohort was 2015. We made 19 investments in 2015. Some of those companies have gone on to be quite successful. One of the largest is actually the market research leader for the industry now, called BDS Analytics. And that firm provides the authoritative market research information. We invested an initial seed amount of $20,000 into BDS Analytics when they first came into the program that would have been late February of 2015. And subsequently invested approximately another $100,000 as they came out of the program. And they've gone on to raise now, I guess, north of $6 million in capital, and are one of the sort of high-flying firms in the cannabis industry. So 19 companies in that first year. BDS Analytics is obviously the top performer there. We also have other companies that people may have heard of, including the travel and media site potguide.com, which was one of the first sites where you could go look for cannabis-friendly travel tourism destinations. Still one of the top hits on Google if you're looking for sites to visit in Colorado or Nevada, Arizona. Other companies include Leaf, which is an indoor at-home smart grow system. That was actually founded by a guy named Yoni out of Tel Aviv. So he actually came over from Tel Aviv to participate in the Canopy Boulder program that first spring in 2015. And Leaf is actually just getting ready to ship their production units right now.
And just give us maybe a sense, so total number of investments the accelerator has made?
Yeah, sorry. So we've done that 4 years in a row. So we've made approximately 19, 20 investments each year. We're up to about 93 total companies. We've also run a partner organization in San Diego for 2 years that invested in a total of 16 companies out of the San Diego market. We also did one offsite location in San Francisco where we invested in, I think it was 9 companies in San Francisco in 2016. So total, we've put to work about, we're going on right around about $8 million, plus a little bit more for follow-on funding that's been deployed. The 2015 cohort, for example, mark-to-market IRR is around 28%, a little bit higher for 2016. We don't really calculate IRR for the 2017 or 2018 funds because they're just getting started, and we really look at raising capital as the larger figure there. And those companies are doing quite well on the capital raise front.
Makes sense. Okay, well, I know that we're going to talk a lot about the transition from kind of accelerator model now into the venture capital business. It sounds like, your view is probably that the market has reached a point today where, your initial ideas back in 2015 may have been premature, but now the VC model does make sense, and that's where the fund is. The 7thirty Opportunity Fund is today. We'll be diving into that, but to understand how we got there, I think I want Kafir to kind of push you and understand a little bit deeper what happened in the industry, what you're seeing, and set the backdrop for why the fund makes sense today.
Yeah. So Mike. Yeah. Hello, everybody. So let's just talk generally about the industry and dive deeper into what your thoughts and what you see in the industry as a long-time player in it. I think everybody on our investors will probably want to know, does cannabis deserve the hype it's getting? Does it deserve the attention it's getting? Or are we seeing some kind of like a graph that is approaching its plateau? What do you think from your vision when you look at startups and technology companies rather than growing operations, and the differences, if you can shed some light on that?
Sure. So it's an interesting industry in that it's a commodity crop eventually. Right now it's a premium crop, which will last for some amount of time. The hype around the industry makes me cringe sometimes, and that's particularly true when I think about public companies on the Canadian market or the U.S. companies that have tried to list up in Canada or on the pink sheets here in the U.S. I do think that a lot of investors who are putting money in at these high valuations for these early stage companies are going to lose out. It's not that the industry doesn't have terrific potential, but it's more a question of timing. And right now the industry is booming. It's growing at about 30% compound annual growth. We expect that to continue for the next, call it at least 5 years. And to be honest, I think the industry will grow much larger than people are expecting right now. However, it is going to take a couple of years for a lot of these companies to really settle in and develop and figure out who's the sustainable winner. So you have these huge valuations like Canopy Growth getting a $4 billion investment from Constellation Brands, which is an alcohol and beverage company. I think that was a fear of missing out move by Constellation Brands, and they needed to put some sort of bet on the cannabis industry. If I were sitting in their boardroom, I'd probably have said, hey, we don't need to make it a $4 billion bet. We could make it maybe a $1 billion bet and do just as well. And that's what you've seen from other, large corporations like AB InBev, even firms like PepsiCo and Coca-Cola are going to jump into this industry. They're already looking at it. You see their representatives at trade shows and they're doing their evaluation. So I think the hype is real, but at the same time, it's a matter of timing if you're an investor. And that's the way, I look at every investment that we make is it not just the right investment? Is it not just a good investment from a business operations point of view and where it sits in the market, but what is the timing going to be on this industry and how long is it going to take for our investment to mature and for us to see a liquidity event?
Yeah, so following on that question, when you as an investor looking at early stage companies and technology verticals within this industry, what do you see compelling? What do you believe are the verticals that is worth keeping an eye on or investing in right now?
Well, I'm a technology investor, by background, and that's really what I tend to look at. This industry is no different in that it has a lot of technology needs. Some of those needs I find particularly intriguing around agriculture, and agriculture technology is probably the one that I find the sexiest, most intriguing. Companies that are figuring out better ways to grow plants more efficiently. I think there's an appetite for that type of business, not just in the cannabis industry, but in general agriculture as well. We're seeing companies like one of the ones we invested in, Pathogen DX, which uses DNA-based microarray testing to identify bacterial or fungal contaminants in agricultural products. That company can shorten the time for safety testing from about 3 days to about 6 hours. And here in the U.S., for example, we actually have had 2 recent agricultural scares around E. coli and Salmonella in lettuce. And that was a good example where this company could have prevented a mass recall. Actually, all the romaine lettuce in the United States got destroyed for a couple of weeks because they couldn't figure out where the contamination was coming from. With this technology, this company, which is starting in cannabis but could easily be applied into the romaine lettuce industry, their technology could have prevented that entire loss of inventory, not to mention, of course, the loss of life that initially caused it.
Mm-hmm. So, talking as an investor in the industry right now, what do you see from the investor side? VCs created around this space, big companies, the big public companies with their huge market caps. What are the powers moving the market right now in the investments side?
Well, I think it's important to break out the market into geography first. So the Canadian companies and Canadian finance in general hasn't been a VC model. They typically just list on the TSX Ventures or Canadian Securities Exchange in order to raise capital as an early stage company. And that's exactly what they did with cannabis. Additionally, Canada legalized cannabis at the federal level. So that made it a lot easier for these companies to go public and to grow very large. The flip side to that is that the companies are micro companies from a revenue point of view. The largest cannabis companies in the world sit in the United States, and they're working within individual states largely. So the California companies are getting to be enormous. The Colorado companies are already very, very large. So the investor community in Canada is driven largely by retail investors, and that's retail investors from around the world. Yes, there's some institutional investors, and their dollar figures can be very, very large, like the Constellation Brands investment. But a lot of the hype and a lot of the reason we see all the headlines is because the writers at these newspapers are writing for retail investors who want to throw a few $1,000s into a stock. And it's very easy to do that off your E-Trade account and jump into a Canadian public company that maybe has, a few $1,000,000 in revenue. Compare that to, even a Colorado company where there are regulatory restrictions on who can make investments into those companies. And so their valuations are much, much lower because the pool of investors is much smaller. We really don't see in the U.S. much institutional investment capital. There are only a handful of firms at the VC level or private equity level that are really making investments into the cannabis sector. So unfortunately, it's mostly angel investors and family offices that are leading the charge. And the challenge for them on that front is due diligence, professionalism, staying active and involved. One of the great things that you get with a large VC fund like a Foundry Group or a Sequoia Capital or somebody like that is professionalism and due diligence. And so it makes it easier for everybody involved on both the entrepreneur side and on the investor side to follow along when Foundry Group makes an investment. They've done a lot of due diligence. Exactly what why they're making that investment, and it's a relatively safe bet as far as VC investment goes. We don't really have much of that in the cannabis industry. Right now, 7thirty Opportunity Fund is one of just a handful of funds that is in this day-to-day, 100% dedicated to the cannabis industry.
Mm-hmm. And when you look at the cannabis market in general and the growth it has enjoyed for the last couple of years, do you think it's a linear line, or do you think there will be some events that will help shape it, hockey stick it, or how do you perceive it?
Yeah, I think it's going to be up and to the right very strongly with that, call it, I think, BDS Analytics estimates at 28%, call it 30% compound annual growth. We're going to see that over time. Now, within that, you're going to see huge surges and, then some ebbs as well. As we see areas legalize. This happened recently with California legalizing. They just legalized at the beginning of 2018, and they did about $2.5 billion in sales in their first year. Now, you can look at a complementary industry. So the alcohol industry in the United States is about $200 billion in direct revenues, and then another $200 billion in sort of secondary level revenues. These are all of the supporting businesses that go around the alcohol industry, from distributors and inventory control systems to HR companies that help with staffing to the scientists and the researchers who are building new alcohol products. So I think we're going to see very similar setups essentially for the cannabis industry growth. Huge surges when a state or a country legalizes. Obviously the European Union, as that figures out legalization, is going to be massive. And one of the big questions there is, what is interstate, intercountry transfer going to look like within the EU? There have been some people, for example, betting on Portugal and Greece to be low-cost providers of the commodity product into the rest of the EU, like they are for some other agricultural products. That could very well be the case, and that's something we're keeping an eye on to understand how this is all really going to evolve.
Mm-hmm. And this is something a little bit controversial, but a lot of times when we discuss about cannabis, people tend and compare it to the crypto hype and the cryptocurrencies markets, saying that there's a lot of money coming in because it's hype, because it's just growing rapidly. Do you think it's a fair comparison? Do you think it's an unfair comparison? And what's your take on that?
I think it's superficially, it makes sense. But as soon as you dive a little deeper, it's a completely different type of industry. I think, and again, being a tech guy, I remember when Bitcoin first came on the market, and we set up a little miner in my office actually back then and played around with it. Should probably have a few coins floating around somewhere on a server. But the reality is that Bitcoin and really blockchain as a concept is a very, very old concept that was revolutionized with a new approach to the software. As it happened, Bitcoin ended up being the poster child for that particular innovation. But as we always said in technology, this was a solution looking for a problem. And what that means is people had to figure out how they wanted to use Bitcoin. They had to figure out what a cryptocurrency would be good for. The reality is, as much as some people dislike the banking system or international finance systems and have concerns about how it works, it actually works relatively well. It's pretty easy for us all to move around, spend money on a credit card, have it translated into a native currency. All of those issues are working pretty well. Quite different, actually, than when I was a teenager backpacking around South America, trying to figure out how to get money out of a bank so I could pay for a train ticket. Cannabis is a bit different in that, right, I look at the cannabis industry and I divide it into 4 sectors. So you've got recreational, which is very much an alcohol-like experience. So, you can have somebody get a buzz off of cannabis, just like they would get a buzz off of alcohol. You have wellness, which is very similar to taking vitamins and supplements, and we typically see that as CBD right now. And CBD products don't get you high, they don't give you a buzz, they just have a wellness benefit to the body. You have pure medical plays, which are similar to CBD, but they're going to be regulated by the government. They're going to be treatments for specific conditions, like the drug that GW Pharma developed for epilepsy treatment. And finally, you have industrial uses, which may be larger than the other 3 combined, to be honest. These are the hemp-based products largely, and hemp oil that can be used to make a form of plastic. So instead of using petroleum and oil products, from the Middle East or wherever you may be mining your oil, you could actually grow hemp and process that into oil and then turn that into a plastic container that's biodegradable. So I sort of break out the whole different thing, and I see, because of that, a very, very big difference between cryptocurrency and where we are with cannabis. As crypto, quite simply, is they're trying to replace like the US dollar, the shekel, or the yuan, whatever it may be. And I think that those, like I said, you're basically a solution looking for a problem to solve. And most of us don't really care enough to shift our whole behaviors. Whereas cannabis, right, if you could actually say, hey, I'm going to cut down on opioid use for pain reduction by rolling out a new CBD-based treatment program, that is a real problem and that is a real solution.
Right, but Micah, on that, if you think about one of the interesting kind of consequences of the crypto experience, it's blockchain, right? And blockchain technology may actually be a solution to many existing problems, for instance, supply chain management, and really creating, improvements through innovation in a sector that couldn't rely on traditional sources in which to innovate. And in that, I see a pretty strong parallel with cannabis. And maybe you can touch on that a little bit, right? But when you think about sort of the ancillary markets that a cannabis investor is going to be looking at, some of the companies that we've seen, from payroll processes to inventory management, kind of across the industry, because traditional industry has been somewhat obscure to the cannabis cultivators, growers, etc., that there's been this wave of innovation around it, maybe like the blockchain to the crypto, and that seems to us kind of interesting. So maybe if you could just touch on kind of the sort of second order innovation that you're seeing in the cannabis market and how it's not just a story about a plant.
Yeah, and this is a fascinating area because, again, to pull on my experience working in cybersecurity for 15 years, the biggest challenge that you often had in the technology world was replacing a legacy system. So, for example, I worked in financial systems where the core technology was from 1968 and written in assembly language and then in COBOL. And every time you wanted to make a change, you had to go in and you had to fix that old system and figure out how you were going to integrate and really merge with it. In this case, with cannabis, we don't have any legacy. So if you're setting up an inventory system, right now, the question is, what inventory should I set up? Not how does it fit into my existing model and my existing business processes. Well, blockchain, of course, is sort of the de facto standard for best-in-class inventory control, supply chain management, because this idea that you don't need to pay a third-party broker to hold the account. Right now, all inventory systems in the traditional world are based on the idea that we're going to have a trusted third party who's going to verify when funds have been received, when inventory has been received, et cetera, when a payment's been made, all of that. And that's what banks really do and central clearing houses do. That entire system doesn't really exist in cannabis because, as you mentioned, those industry leaders aren't serving the cannabis industry. And then the idea that we could set up blockchain to solve some of those problems is really fascinating. Now, additionally, the reason people want to use blockchain is not just because it is a more efficient solution, it also provides additional benefits. And one of those can be anonymity at the sort of superficial level while guaranteeing that a transaction is actually authentic. And this is sort of a neat concept, right? That I don't necessarily want to divulge somebody's personal information. We all understand how important privacy is now, given all of the issues with Facebook and Google and all the data mining. And blockchain can actually sort of split the difference there, where you're able to verify that a transaction is real without disclosing exactly who was involved in the transaction if you don't want to do that. And we've seen some really interesting plays where this has been set up in the cannabis industry to guarantee to the government that everybody involved in the transaction was a licensed business, for example, but without disclosing to other people who those businesses were at the superficial level. So really, really interesting way to look at it. And it's an area we're very keen on investing in.
So let's look back, and you're based in Boulder, Colorado, and maybe one of the most thriving areas right now in cannabis and startups around cannabis. We here in Israel, and we combine forces together, and maybe you can give our crowd a little bit of what you think about appealing for you in the Israeli cannabis ecosystem and the things coming out of Israel. It can be technology-wise, agriculture, proofing. Give us a little bit of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Israel's been famous for a long time now for doing a lot with very little. The country is small in terms of geography, it's small in terms of population, but it's big in terms of thinking, and it's big in terms of innovation. And that's exactly what we've seen in both technology in general and agricultural technology in particular. So some of the farming technologies coming out of Israel, for example, are really fascinating. And one of the biggest challenges that agricultural technologies companies face is getting started. Because when you're talking about agriculture, you're typically talking about a low value item. So if I'm growing lettuce, for example, one piece of lettuce is worth essentially nothing. So I need massive volumes and massive scale to bring the lettuce to market in a cost-effective way. Now, let's say we're a startup that has a better way to do fertilization or irrigation for lettuce. Well, the reality is it takes us forever to convince these large companies to try it out. And quite simply, our solution is almost certainly not cost-effective when we first get started because we're still doing research and development. And so we're seeing firms like this come out of Israel. Same on the technology side with a blockchain solution, with supply chain solutions, all sorts of really interesting tech. They can jump into the cannabis market and they find a fertile ground in the cannabis market where while it is a commodity crop and the prices are dropping, they're still much, much higher than lettuce. So one cannabis plant, for example, in Colorado might be worth between $500 and $1,000. So if you can bring efficiency to growing a crop where each plant is worth that much money, you can prove a lot of your technology. You can really grow and bloom with the industry. And oh, by the way, the industry itself of cannabis is getting big enough to support some really big companies. Colorado has $1.5 billion in retail sales last year. We only have 5 million people. So that's quite a bit of consumption per person here in Colorado. We do have 40 million visitors because of our great ski mountains. So we have a good visitor community. But we're one of the largest markets in the world for cannabis. We've been around with a fully functional open market since 2014. And oh, by the way, this pairs with Israel's lead in biotech research. And particularly because the Israeli government has authorized some of the top researchers in the world to do research on cannabis for a long time, we have really terrific technology coming out of the Israeli biotech community as well. Things like rapid onset delivery systems or new genetics around the cannabis plant itself.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to wrap up our industry discussion. And when we walked the floor together in Vegas in the big MJB's conference, we saw thousands of people that are trying to enjoy this green rush, I would call it, people want to invest in the companies. What do you think, as a professional investor, being in this industry since the very early days, are the tools, the toolbox that a VC, that an investor in this industry should have, and things to look at, things to learn and autodidact yourself on?
Sure. So the key for me in really all aspects of my professional life is an old mantra I have about data, information, insight. So you need data in order to start to begin understanding a market. That data then is sort of compiled in your brain into information. And from that information, you derive insights. So I would say that investors who are trying to work in this industry and trying to build wealth and value in this industry, the number one thing you need data and information. And that means understanding the difference in the market between Canada and the United States, between Colorado and Oregon, between Nevada and Massachusetts, understanding what's going to happen with exports coming out of Israel, what's going to be the long-term cultivation scene with places like Colombia coming online with what will likely be the very low-cost cultivation solution for the world, to be honest. Meanwhile, you have sort of disruptive developments like Great Britain legalizing medical marijuana in 6 months, from going from a negative to a positive in a very, very short period of time. So that data and that information is really key, and it means a lot of work. It means a lot of engagement in this industry in order to stay abreast and current of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think we wrapped up the industry discussion, and Richard will pick it up from here regarding the fund and a little bit of more background on that.
So thank you, Kafir. First of all, a bunch of questions came in on the fund side, so people clearly are interested to understand how this backdrop plays into what the fund is actually going to go out and do. So first of all, just the basic facts. Remind us kind of the size of the fund, basic economics, and then maybe let's dive into the strategy and what you actually plan to be investing in.
Sure. So $30 million target size for the fund. Pretty standard VC economics. We do a 2% management fee. We have a 10% preferred return on committed capital, and then we do a 75-25 split of proceeds from the profits of the fund after we have that 10% preferred return. We are located in the U.S., but our geographic focus, while definitely focused in the U.S., is global. We see companies from all over the world participating in this market. I'll say that the U.S. market is about 80% or more of the global market. So even a company, let's say out of Tel Aviv, is going to have clients in the United States, most likely.
And in terms of the strategy of the fund, just sort of give us a sense of, you spend a lot of time on very, very, very early stage investments on the incubator side, or the accelerator side, I apologize. And now, the fund is early stage, but what does that mean? And what will it do? What won't it do? Plant, not plant, retail, leisure, lifestyles, wellness. There's a lot of terms that we've thrown around today. I think it would be really helpful to concretize exactly what it is that the fund is actually looking to deploy into.
Yeah, so we're not going to deploy into cultivation or retail operations. So those are the plant touching businesses, and we don't really see a great play for us as a fund into those particular sectors. Cultivation is farming, and retail is really a real estate type of play, neither one of which is our focus area. So we're looking at the value-added solutions in the industry. Those are largely technology plays because they're also, from a VC point of view, the most scalable plays. So, for example, loyalty programs and retail and consumer engagement platforms are very, very interesting. All of the data and analytics plays are fascinating to us. The agricultural technology plays, some of the biotech plays in terms of the research around safety testing, laboratory testing, very, very intriguing on that front. There are some very, very interesting solutions coming out with regard to sort of retail optimization. This is a very unique category using cutting edge technology to improve the retail experience. And of course, everybody wants to compete with online sales. So you need to somehow make the retail experience more engaging and more interesting. So even a company like the Peak Beyond, which does smart consumer tables in retail environments, is a great example of a technology play that we're keeping an eye on. We also, from a revenue point of view and sort of where the companies are in terms of maturity, we're looking for companies that have gone beyond the accelerator and call it seed funding stage. So these are typically companies that are going to be, doing, call it north of 40,000 a month in recurring revenues. That's about 500,000 a year in recurring revenues. We want to get involved early still. We trust our judgment in terms of understanding how to look at early stage companies because we have a lot of experience investing in those companies. So we can get better value and drive a better position on the term sheet and then sitting on the board as one of the directors of the company, leading the company forward.
And that's helpful. And before we dive too much further into exactly how you guys will operate, I think it might be a good time to introduce, who is the rest of the team when you talk about the we at 7thirty, who's supporting this endeavor?
Yeah, so I'm the fund manager and the primary point person for all of this. My associates, Jamul Jadamba, Ben Richardson, Mick Garrett as well, and then a whole deep team of more informal advisors that I've built up over the last 5 years of working in this industry. And Jamul brings a wealth of experience on international engagements. He actually worked for a long time in the commodities industry all around the world. Ben Richardson is a really, really experienced retail and public equities analyst who came out of JP Morgan in the chemicals and agricultural sector. So he brings a due diligence level of acumen and understanding that's really excellent, looking at financials and understanding where these companies can go and how they can be structured. Mick Garrett's a serial entrepreneur. He actually was started in the mining industry and earth moving business, working with some very, very large companies in that sector before moving into geospatial work. And he's done a large amount of technical work. He was actually the CTO for a firm that became one of Airbus's main subsidiaries around geospatial information management.
Got it. Strong team. And in terms of how you see sort of the R-Crowd relationship and ways that you expect R-Crowd to bring value to the fund?
Yeah, I think that the R-Crowd network is really exceptional. A global network of early stage smart investors is incredibly valuable. Obviously, looking through the historical performance of R-Crowd, what they've been able to bring to the table in terms of raising capital, but also building the networks is really, really important. Of course, the tie into the Israeli tech community is also very, very valuable for us. As I said, I think Israel is obviously second to none in terms of the innovation around technology and agriculture in some of these areas that we see as prime candidates for investment. Very
good. And you touched a little bit on some of the existing investments in the fund, but maybe just paint a picture for people, kind of where we're at today in the fundraise, how much of that has been deployed, and then what has it been deployed into? So we talked about BDS analytics for a moment in context of the accelerator, pathogen diagnostics, but that there's another great company behind that, and so some color on that would be helpful.
Yeah, we've made 3 investments so far. So BDS Analytics, the market research firm, Pathogen DX, which is that DNA-based safety testing firm, and a company called Deep Green AI, artificial intelligence solution to use basic photographs taken with any normal camera to identify problems in plants. The problems that they started with were actually fungus and mildew. Anybody who's ever tried to do any gardening or raise some plants knows that you can get mildew or fungus and it'll spread and ruin an entire crop. Well, that is one of the top priorities in the cannabis industry, is eliminating fungus and mildew. One of the challenges in the cannabis industry, of course, is because this is a consumable product by humans, you can't use normal antifungal solutions to destroy the fungus on the plant. In fact, the testing that's required by the government to ensure the safety of cannabis is a higher degree of testing than is required for any other agricultural product that humans consume. So, for example, that lettuce outbreak of E. coli and salmonella in the U.S., that never would have happened in the cannabis industry because the government requires testing around the cannabis products.
So to be clear, right, there's three companies in the fund. One is in the machine learning space. One is in, so computer vision machine learning. One is in, deep med tech diagnostics, and then the third is in kind of industry-wide analytics. That's a pretty broad scope. Should we expect that to continue in terms of really reaching the far corners of the industry in general, and in terms of kind of the number of companies that we would expect to see in the fund? Just give us a sense for that, where you think that will shake out to.
Yeah, I think we'll be in the mid-teens for the number of investments. That'll obviously depend a bit in terms of follow-on investments and where we want to go, putting additional capital into certain companies. But I would guess it's probably mid-teens is where we end up. So we've made 3 so far. I'd be looking at, let's say, another 10 to 12 investments there. I think that the focus will, like I said, agricultural technology, supply chain technologies, some of these sort of core marketplace dynamics. These are all going to be big plays for us, and we'll continue making some investments. I think that the ag tech is likely to have 3 or 4 companies around agricultural technology in particular. Some of the others, the market research firm, BDS Analytics is sort of the dominant player there. I don't know that we would double up on an investment in that particular sector, but there is room above and below that where we may go into a data and analytics company of some sort.
Great, and I know this is a bit of an industry question, but I think it's kind of relevant for the fund thesis as well. The noise in cannabis today seems very much to be in the public markets, right? I mean, when you look at companies like Tilray and the types of valuations, at least they were getting, and even still today, just relative to any kind of sane valuation metric, is a little bit hard to justify. And I think that's partly why Kafir was asking all the questions around hype and concerns around value that should make any VC investor a little bit nervous. Tell us about why the sector, the focus, the package of what the fund is doing makes sense relative to what else you're seeing in the industry, where else you could play in cannabis, and why, if I'm a retail investor, I don't just go buy public stocks on the Canadian market, but I think 7thirty Opportunity Fund, or at least the strategy that you're articulating, is a sensible, prudent place for me to get involved in cannabis.
Sure. The number one issue here is we have information arbitrage happening in this particular industry. We have, in the United States, I think about 38 states that have some form of legal cannabis industry. And that ranges from Colorado, where it's a full and open market, where pretty much anybody can get a license, going through a basic background check, and anybody can start a business and get going, to states where it's extremely restricted and you only have a couple of operators, a couple of players. Then you have Canada, where it's federally legal but government run, in a really small market. The rule of thumb is the Canadian market will be 10% of the US market in any given industry, and that's probably true for cannabis as well. What this all means is we have an opportunity as more informed investors to place money and to place capital into opportunities that no one else is really seeing. And this is largely a matter of being able to wade through the hype and ignore all the headlines in the newspapers in order to find the companies that are actually producing growing revenues, that are establishing intellectual property value in, let's say, research and development around agricultural technology or biotech solutions. And that's what I mean when I refer to the US companies are already the largest companies in the world. So people talk about Tilray and they talk about Canopy Growth. Well, Select Oil in California is larger than either of those companies. Nobody knows about Select Oil, and nobody realizes what they're doing as an entity. But if you looked at the data coming out of BDS Analytics, you would realize that they are one of the dominant players in the California market space. The same thing applies to looking at a company like Wana in the Colorado market, where it's a very dominant player with a huge market share in the Colorado market. If you don't know that, then you gravitate towards Tilray, because CNBC is going to run another article on what they're doing and how they're going to open up this market in Portugal. Well, that's intriguing, except for the fact that there are only 90,000 patients in all of Germany. So if you're looking to export from Portugal to Germany, you're looking to sell to an addressable market of 90,000 patients. Now, in 2 or 3 years, I'm sure the German market will be much larger. It'll still be smaller than California alone. It'll still be smaller likely than the Colorado market is right now. So information arbitrage is really the crux of where 730 Opportunity Fund sits. And my job is to gather as much data, get as much information as possible to make insightful plays and invest our capital wisely.
Awesome. All right. So what I want to do now is let's turn to a few quick fire questions, just a few light ones before we go into Q&A from the crowd. So, Kfir, if you wanna jump in first with one.
Yeah. So a question I hear a lot from our investors and everybody in the industry is, when do you think the U.S. will legalize on the federal level the cannabis industry, and what would that, how will that affect the market and what we're seeing today?
My guess on legalization in the U.S. is 2022. I think this administration is going to be busy with some other issues, and my guess is it would be after the next presidential election that the focus could shift to legalizing cannabis at the federal level. I know there's a lot of intrigue around trying to do it quickly, and there is good public support for legalization. However, like I said, I think there are a lot of other complex issues going on in the U.S. federal government right now that may quite simply take all the energy from people to do it. Another piece of this, by the way, is that federal legalization is almost certainly going to involve handing the issue to states. So what that means is each state will then come up with its own solution. It would be like the European Union saying, okay, it's legal in theory, but every single country is going to have to figure out how they want to handle this individually.
Okay, quick one. Best reading to stay current on industry trends.
So I look at two things primarily. MJ Biz Daily is a daily news email. They do a great job curating about 3 or 4 salient topics to read about. Usually do a great graphic as well, so really like that publication. I also read Weed Week by a guy named Alex Halperin, who's a journalist he's a bulldog. He's a great journalist, really digs deep, and he does a weekly email that summarizes all of the news that's fit to print for the cannabis industry, and he has a good snarky tone, which appeals to my sarcastic personality.
Very good. Where is the business location you traveled in the last year that you liked the most, or was more exciting for you?
Well, the best one for me was going to Hong Kong for the first time. Really amazing city. What a history there. Sitting on Victoria Harbor, getting coffee a couple mornings was a pretty spectacular experience, despite the 20-hour flight to get over there.
Okay, last one from me. Who's going to win the Super Bowl?
Well, I'm from New England, so the Patriots, of course. We had a spectacular game last night, winning in overtime. What a performance by Tom Brady. It gives faith to people like me who are 40-something years old. So.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? 2000, I think, that he drafted him. Unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the other quarterback said something about the fact that he grew up, Mahomes, grew up like watching him. He was a big fan of him growing up.
Well, probably not such a fan after last night. Okay, cool. Let's turn this over now to a few questions from the crowd in the last few minutes that we have together. So, guys, as a reminder, if you're still with us, first of all, it's been a fantastic webinar so far. But if you do have further questions that you haven't had a chance to either submit already or haven't been addressed so far in the conversation, please do submit them. I've seen one comment already that says wrong, the LA Rams. We're not going to go back into that debate. But sticking on industry questions. So we had a question: have you made any investments in Israel yet? And I mean, I know you talked that there's only 3 investments in the fund so far, and I know none of those are Israeli. But maybe you could speak a little bit about kind of on the accelerator side, what exposure you had to Israel or Israeli founders, and going forward, how you see yourself potentially playing in the Israeli market.
Yeah, so like I mentioned early on in the webinar, one of our first accelerator investments was into a company called Leaf. Yoni Ophir is the founder of Leaf. and it's an in-home smart grow system. Connects to your smartphone and allows you to grow. I think it was 4 plants total in an indoor, really cool-looking module that you could put in your living room. So we've definitely made some investments into Israeli-backed, Israeli-led companies. I fully expect we'll make a couple of our investments into firms coming out of Israel. Kafir and I met, gosh, I don't know, 9 months ago or something when we first sort of engaged. And since then, he's helped to bring us in touch with half a dozen different companies, many very interesting founders and good plays there. Some around the genetic side that are really fascinating with some of the genetic research, a bunch of devices coming out, like one in-home lab testing device that looked very, very interesting. So we fully expect to make a couple of those investments into Israeli-backed companies.
Great. So another one came in. What patterns do you see that would show this is a market maturing from a micro market to a truly mature industry? And I know that there's a you track on state level, et cetera. So maybe dive into kind of some of the signals you look for.
Yeah, I'm a pattern guy, right? Pattern recognition is what I really focus on as an investor. And Colorado is the oldest market, started in 2014 with fully legal operational sales. Oregon and Washington were right with it, launching just a couple months later. So we're seeing these 3 markets in particular reach maturity. What do we see with the maturation is consolidation of the successful operators, rolling up smaller operators or people who are now tired of running these startups. We're seeing price points decline in a more reasonable fashion. Wholesale Colorado cannabis was around $3,000 a pound on the wholesale market when we launched. It's now, call it $600 to $800 a pound. So massive declines. However, over the last year, we've only seen a decline of maybe 5 or 10% in that price point. So we're seeing some stabilization there. Number of new products coming on the market, still very, very high. That indicates that we still have some way to go in terms of maturation of the market on the retail level. This speaks to something that we didn't have time to touch on about the industry, but there is a misunderstanding that the industry is simply the legalization of the black market, and that is not correct at all. The black market legalization is a substantial minority of the market, but the development of new products and the next generation of products that are based on cannabis is the emerging trend. And we're seeing all sorts of new technologies around sublingual delivery for rapid onset without smoking, and all these other issues that are coming to bear. That we're seeing in these mature markets. So you see consumers who've been purchasing now for 3 years on the Colorado market, they're more discerning consumers. They care more about the flavor, the profile, the health benefits of these products. The same way, I guess, when we first started drinking beer, we just wanted beer, and it was just beer, and that's all we wanted. And now you can go to the Great American Beer Festival and see something like 3,000 different breweries bringing all sorts of different beers to market, because there are all these discerning consumers who want a sour flavored beer or a cherry flavored beer or a dark brown beer that's light in calories somehow.
It's a good segue.
So yeah, it's a segue into a question that one of our investors just asked here. So let me just broaden the scope a little bit. We see in the cannabis industry in the United States a change in consumer behavior. It's moving to vapes, the growth in edibles, and the other delivery methods you mentioned. What do you see as the future of that? Where is it going in terms of retail experience and brands and those kind of opportunities, and also the technology being involved in them, and the big players like the Canopies, the Tilrays, the Auroras. Yeah, your take.
Yeah, so huge trend towards concentrates. This is an easier delivery system, easier, more convenient mechanism for people to consume cannabis. The vape world is booming. Very, very fast growing segment. Edibles have also grown from about 12% of the market up to about 16% of the market, but 50% of the market is still flower. So that's part of this, you got to understand the market in order to make investments. While the fastest growing category is concentrates, the largest category is still flower. I think what we're going to see again is more discerning consumers. We're going to see people who really jump into learning about this product and figuring out how they want to consume it. And that is a very different thing than simply saying, can I get some cannabis either to relax on a Friday night or to help with my backache on a Tuesday morning. We're now seeing, for example, complex formulations of the various chemical compounds, sometimes at the genetic level in the plant. So we have companies like Front Range Biosciences that are working on designing plants to maximize or minimize certain chemicals. The way that you would change an apple, for example, to make it more crisp, so it stands up to baking, or juicier or sweeter so it's easier to eat. We're seeing that sort of development in cannabis. And I think we'll continue to see that. I think if I'm sitting in the Canopy Growth boardroom or the Tilray boardroom, I'm largely looking at those areas because that's something that is a very intriguing long-term prospect. And I can actually work on it in Canada without being able to access the US market and do some of that genetics work. We're seeing the same work out of Israel, particularly on the medical side, with some really top researchers in the medical field designing cannabis solutions for various medical treatments. And again, this will be a very intriguing area to watch over the next decade or so.
So one thing that we haven't touched on, and I can tell from some of the feedback on the webinar, is that this conversation has really stayed to the very institutional or the very, I would say, expert side of the market. But cannabis didn't always have those characteristics, and for a long time, the players in the space were a very long way from institutional. And I think in some respects were somewhat unsavory as well. And Kafir and I spent a lot of time over the last year diligencing the cannabis market and trying to find what the right investment would be for our crowd. And I think that's that led us to you, Micah, to 7thirty, and we feel, having really surveyed the scene, that you stand out. But that's not to say that there aren't other sophisticated, experienced, high quality investors in the market. But it is true that the market today, and probably the crypto market is a good analogy again for this, is still populated with the kind of actors that more mature, fully legal industries don't necessarily have, or at least have a much lower concentration of, like relative to the total landscape. And so the question that we got in is an interesting one that said, do those players from the black market days of cannabis, are they going to exist in the new world order? And if so, kind of, does that leave sort of any residual problems, or do you see that as sort of a watch out for you as you navigate your investment landscape? Just sort of thoughts on that, and how you differentiate is very helpful.
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult landscape to navigate in terms of the black market to the gray market to the legal market. So, for example, many people may have heard me refer to Colorado as the oldest fully operational market, and they may, sort of say BS, that was really California back when they legalized in 1995. But the difference there is that they didn't really form a market in 1995 and 96 in California. They just sort of said, hey, medical is legal, and that was sort of it. And there weren't licenses. There was no way to verify if somebody was a legitimate business person. There was no central database, for example, or blockchain solution to look up and see if you were dealing with a good operator. That has now changed. And with these legal markets, you can now verify that you're doing business with a legitimate business, it's paying its taxes, that has background checks on its founders, all of these things. Really, really important to do as we are looking to make investments in this industry. It is a hard landscape to navigate, particularly because the rules are different state to state. And country to country. So, an organization that's legal in California could be in violation of laws in Nevada, for example. And you need to understand that and really look at each opportunity on an individual basis. The due diligence process is a little bit different than a normal tech investment, where you are digging into people's personal backgrounds, understanding who they are. And also, I think, let's be honest, there are a lot of scammers out there in a booming industry, just like in crypto. So it's very easy to get taken for a ride if you aren't careful and you don't do background checks on people. You don't dive in and do, for example, in-person site visits to check out facilities and see what's really going on.
Very good. All right. Well, Micah, that brings us right up to the hour mark now. So, first, I just want to thank you for joining today and for partnering with our crowd in general, we are really, really excited about this opportunity. I think that those on the call today have had the chance to hear what a thoughtful approach you take to this exciting industry, and this gives people a sense of why our crowd chose to invest in 7thirty and why we continue to be very, very excited about the investment opportunity ahead of us. So thank you again for taking the time. Certainly, if you had questions that weren't answered on the webinar, or any other things that you want to find out about the fund, do be in touch with your investor relations representative. And we've just launched the fund now, so hopefully you'll have plenty of opportunities to interact with Micah. He's going to be going on the road with us over the next couple of months, and we'll be putting more content out there to keep you guys informed about both the fund and the industry. So I think that's it from us for now. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you,
Thanks,
Micah.
guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike.
Bye.
Good day. Bye-bye.